This is episode 75 of Ethics and Culture Cast from Notre Dame's DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Welcome to episode 75 of Ethics and Culture Cast from Notre Dame's DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm Ken Hellenius, the communications specialist at the center. In this episode, we chat with Aimee Murphy, founder of Rehumanize International, a human rights organization dedicated to creating a culture of peace and life. We discuss her new book, Rehumanize, a vision to secure human rights for all, and explore the principles of the consistent life ethic. Let's sit down together for this fascinating conversation. Well, Aimee Murphy, thank you so much for taking time to be with us on the podcast.
It is such a joy to be with you here today, Ken. Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you do your studies? Kind of those sorts of things.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in California. When I was thinking about going to college, I applied to like 11 schools or something absurd like that and ended up going to my first choice, Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and fell in love with Pittsburgh so much that by the end of my first semester at CMU, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to live in Pittsburgh now. Pittsburgh is my home.
Okay.
So I live in Pittsburgh now with my husband and our two housemates and our dog, Domino. And right now we're on this big cross-country book tour. Actually, all four and doggy one of us together in our SUV with our little pop-up camper, driving all over the country to share the message of the consistent life ethic.
Just over 10 years ago, you founded the organization Rehumanize International and its predecessor, Life Matters Journal. So what does the word rehumanize mean to you?
Oh, yeah. We had so much fun when we were renaming the organization in 2017 because rehumanized was not yet a word in the dictionary. So we got to sit down and brainstorm really like what the definition of the word should be according to us. So the definition that we settled on was to restore to humans the sense of selfhood and individuality, or to recognize and respect the inherent dignity due to human beings after they have been dehumanized. And the thing is, like, the word dehumanization and dehumanize has been part of our lexicon for a while now. Mm-hmm. So it's funny and interesting to me that the word rehumanize wasn't also, part and parcel of including that word in our dictionary, which perhaps speaks to, like, yes, an understanding of the wrong, but not necessarily a vision of where to go to really restore that dignity, to really enshrine a protection for humanity from conception to natural death, from womb to tomb, in our laws, in our society, in academia, etc. So we really saw it as an opportunity to set the tone for what rehumanize means. So I hope that definition remains a part of the wider conversation in our culture.
Yeah. Well, now, your book is entitled Rehumanize, a vision to secure human rights for all. So it includes a comprehensive introduction to the consistent life ethic, which you hinted at discovering what that was through encountering other groups that were promoting this and that were kind of carrying that banner before you. So help us unpack exactly what you mean by, and what we mean by, consistent life ethic.
Yeah, so the core of the consistent life ethic is the belief that each and every human being has inherent dignity and worth and value and rights simply because We are members of the human species. So this is something that's intrinsic to us, not something that is conferred by the state, but something that is recognized by the state, by cultures in general. And what this translates into, in terms of the consistent life ethic, is opposition to all forms of aggressive violence. Basically, understanding that each and every human being has the fundamental right to live free from aggressive violence. So this includes opposition to acts of violence like embryo destruction, abortion, war, torture, police brutality, the death penalty, carceral torture, euthanasia, filicide, assisted suicide, abuse, enslavement, and homicide, and all other forms of aggressive violence against human beings. And it's interesting because if you listen to that list, I'm sure you'll see that opposition to each of these acts of violence spans and transcends the modern partisan political paradigm that we have in this country. And I think that exists in a lot of countries. We don't have a major political party that stands for human rights and human dignity in all stages and in all circumstances. So the consistent life ethic movement is beautifully diverse. I'd say not just nonpartisan, but transpartisan, interpartisan. Like it flouts, the system that exists right now. And we also tend to be a very religiously and socioeconomically diverse coalition as well, because it really is a philosophy where we can have every human standing for the rights of and in solidarity with every human.
Yeah. Well, and that's where actually I remember meeting you. You came to the Vita Institute and you represented yourself, a person of faith, but also representing an organization that was very, very big tent.
Totally. And our new executive director, Herb Garrity, has been involved with the organization since 2016 and, is an atheist active in the movement. We have folks who have worked with us who have been Muslim, Buddhist, agnostic, Protestant, Catholic, Quaker. Yeah, we just have such a diverse group of people, and I myself am a member of the LGBT community. We have several members of our organization and our broader coalition who are also part of the LGBT community. And, we have people who range from, far right ANCAP libertarians all the way to far left Marxist communists, and everywhere in between. And I love that because what I think that diversity really says to our culture is that it doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what your religious beliefs are or your political background is. You are welcome here. And you have a space in this movement. And in fact, that diversity also speaks to just the agreeableness. I don't even know if that's a word. Just the idea that the consistent life ethic is not only understandable, but agreeable to people of all sorts of different backgrounds. And I think it just gets back to this idea that it is a philosophy for all humanity. It's not just, this right-wing conservative Catholic ideology. It really is a philosophy for all, even if it was popularized in, modern Catholic circles. That there are people who range from humanist, feminist, non-aggression principle or personalist or, all sorts of religious backgrounds who can come together because we understand that the very first and foundational human right is the right to live free from violence.
You just used a phrase that is actually the title of your opening and foundational chapter of your book, which is A Philosophy for All Humanity. That again is the introduction to a consistent life ethic that also You're very smart in your rhetorical approach because you anticipate a lot of the objections that I'm sure you've heard countless times, including one of them being the question of, well, I'm really passionate about this portion of defending life. I'm really passionate about euthanasia, or I'm really passionate about disability rights. Does that mean that I can't spend time focusing on just this part? And I think you really do a good job of addressing that.
It's one of the arguments that we get a lot is, number one, can I focus on single issue work? And number two, what do we do about the misuse of the consistent life ethic? And those are things that Cardinal Bernardin, as the early popularizer of this philosophy, he answered back then, like in the 70s and 80s, and it holds true today, that single issue work is how we get so much done. Like, we need people who are dedicated and passionate and spend the bulk of their time working to end single issues like euthanasia or abortion or the death penalty or, working for disability rights. The important thing, number one, is not to spread yourselves too thin. And number two, to carry the philosophy of the consistent life ethic in all that you do, which basically means don't be out here undermining the work of single issue activists as long as they're consistently holding to consistent life ethic principles. It's pretty fruitless to say, well, you're working to end the death penalty, but I think you should be working to end abortion. Because fundamentally, working to end any of these forms of violence speaks to the inherent dignity of the human person. And one of the claims that I think a lot of consistent life ethic adherents get is, oh, well, you're watering down whatever, the message for whatever issue. And the thing that I hope is that we're not watering down any message, but that we are pointing people to the central and most important truth for any of these issues of violence. And that hopefully we can draw together a broader coalition of people to work to end, whatever single issue of violence it is that, any one given person is working to affect. The second thing that I want to mention here is the misuse of the consistent life ethic. I think it's a really common, argument and point against our movement. And Cardinal Bernardin has just a really spicy quote that I included in the first chapter of the book that basically says that, voting for politicians who think that abortion is a basic right of an individual is a misuse of the consistent life ethic. And he says, and I deplore it. And I think that's just a fascinating and snappy, pithy, right to the root of the question response, because he understood that people were, attempting to use the consistent life ethic to vote for politicians who supported some form of violence, but also, maybe might be more pro-immigrant or, working on ending poverty or working on ending houselessness or stuff like that. And so basically what he was saying right then and there was voting for politicians who support violence as a basic right is contrary to the consistent life ethic. And, authentic adherents of this philosophy wouldn't be attempting to justify, a vote in support of violence in general, that we would be calling for a better alternative. I often say that when it comes to politics, I have a really low bar in terms of whether or not I will consider voting for someone. My low bar is so low, it is the ground. My low bar is I would consider voting for someone if they oppose aggressive violence against human beings and their policy and their beliefs, etc. Like, I won't vote for someone who supports violence. Like, that is my low bar. And if any politician is tripping over that bar, if that bar is an obstacle to them, it is because they have dug themselves a hole. The basic right of every human to live free from violence should be our bare minimum. And I think it's honestly only because we have been in this situation of, quote unquote, choosing the lesser of two evils over and over and over again that has led us to this moment, this political moment where the evil just keeps getting more and more entrenched in the system. We just accept it as the status quo. And we need to stand up and demand better. We need to be unwilling to compromise our conscience and our values and throw humans under the bus for political expediency.
Makes it difficult to vote for anyone.
Preach. Amen. Yes. Totally. And maybe I don't know how that would end up panning out, but I think we need to demand better. And ultimately, the thing that I understand and that I hope others can also understand is that when it comes to voting, our vote will have such an infinitesimally small impact on the outcome of any given election, beyond maybe like a school board vote. But how we vote will 100% of the time impact our consciences. And to me, that, like, the battle for the soul of our nation or whatever, it's less of an actual political battle in the halls of Congress, our state Congress or our national Congress. And it's more about the things we do day in and day out, and more about our consciences as individuals and the things that we are willing to justify in order to achieve political power. So the thing I want to leave with your listeners today is just to remember that the things that you do day in and day out in your community are going to make more of a difference ultimately than most of the policies that could be passed by any Congress. That the way that you live in solidarity with the vulnerable, the way that you participate in mutual aid and you participate in community on a local level is going to have more of an impact than your one vote for in any given race.
Yeah. Perhaps my favorite sentence in your book is also the biggest challenge and opportunity, I guess, too. You write, quote, "Even if we ended all aggressive violence, we would need to work to protect and bolster the dignity of our fellow humans," end quote. So big question here, and you may have actually anticipated your answer in what you just said. How do we do that in this culture, this pervasive American culture of expressive individualism, as Professor Carter Snead writes, versus the culture that acknowledges our interdependence on one another?
Totally. And I've been thinking about this topic a lot, and I'm already imagining, like version 1.5 or 2.0 of the book, where I include a reference to Leo Labresco-Sargent's pieces on interdependence and community. Because one of the things I include in chapter 12, put these ideas into action, in a section titled "Use Your Freedom for Community." I learned in the past 2 years while, reading and doing various research for the book, the word freedom comes from the Indo-European root word fria, spelled F-R-I-Y-A. And the word friend also comes from the same root word fria. And this root word fria means beloved. And my own name, Aimee, also means beloved. So when I found this out, I did a little happy dance. It's like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. But this idea of freedom that this root word fria gets at is that freedom was really when free people were really tied to one another in kinship, rights of belonging, and things like this. And that this word freedom with the root word fria really indicates that what freedom was the ability to ensure that together we would all have the things that we needed to survive. We had food, shelter, community, love. That we had the things that we needed to live together in community, that this word freedom was for community. It was for this beloved community, to call back to Martin Luther King Jr. And, so I I guess I contradict the modern popular understanding of freedom as independence, perhaps, this expressive individualism, this radical individualism. And here I've also learned a lot from personalist philosophers who specifically, created this movement, this philosophical movement of personalism to challenge the movements of Marxist communism in Russia, but also the radical individualism of a lot of Western Europe. They saw that both of these movements were flouting some aspect of the human experience, that this radical individualism was seeing the individual and their right to do whatever they wanted at the expense of the community, but that this, radical collectivism of communist Russia was seeing the good of the community at the expense of the dignity of the individual. And so these personalist philosophers have really talked about weaving together this understanding of the rights and dignity of the individual in the context of human community, which is, we're a communal, we are a social species, we are meant to live in community. And I think that this challenge to us going forward is to build communities that acknowledge our interdependence on one another, that don't see, for example, disability, purely from this medical less than perspective, but as a social problem that we need to work together to create inclusive spaces. So, this is, I think, the challenge going forward, and community is going to be not only the answer to violence, but also, I think, the answer to so much dehumanization and prejudice that exists in our culture today. I think community and encounter are going to be the answers to ableism, ageism, homophobia and transphobia, classism, sexism, and racism. These are things that impact dehumanization and violence, but we have to not only address, the violence that precipitates out from those forms of dehumanization, but we also have to get at the root of that prejudice and that violence and that dehumanization. And the only way that we can do that is through community, is through encounter, is through understanding our interdependence and interconnectedness with one another.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned you've been on this nationwide tour. Who's receiving your book? Who's reading this?
I think a lot of our early readers have been friends and fans of Rehumanize International. The reason that I wrote this book, though, yes, for our friends, for our fans, but I honestly wrote this book for 16-year-old me, who was coming into human rights activism, to pro-life activism, as an uneducated teenager who didn't know where she belonged in these movements, who didn't know if I belonged in these movements, honestly, because I had been told that the pro-life world was such a conservative and Christian environment, that it was homophobic and things like that. And so learning about the existence of inclusive organizations like Feminists for Life and Playgal and Secular Pro-Life, et cetera, has been such a boon to me. And so this book really lays out, what is a consistent life ethic? What's the movement around it? What are the issues that are involved? How do I learn about those issues? How do I learn how to talk about those issues? It really is aimed at new activists or even old activists who, just want a quick reference guide to be able to come back to again and again, to be equipped to talk about the issues within the consistent life ethic, but also just, to continue to provoke conversation, because at the end of every chapter is a set of discussion questions and suggested further reading. So this book really is built for this context of existing in community and reading together. So there have already been several school groups that I know of. This is the next book on their book club list, where they will read it together and, just actually go through the discussion questions as a group. So I'm hoping that it will be a great jumping off point, that it will provoke some just excellent and rehumanizing conversations. Because one of the things that I say near the end of the book is that it's important to have these spicy conversations with people who agree as well as those who disagree, because fundamentally that's how we change hearts and minds, is by existing in those uncomfortable spaces with people who disagree with us and being willing to just continually show up and demonstrate that we care. So I'm excited to see what will come from it. And I'm hopeful that it can help lead the next generation of consistent life ethic activists to make big changes where they are.
Yeah. Well, what's next for you, Aimee Murphy?
Well, I still have something like 20 stops left on my book tour.
Okay.
So if anyone is interested in learning more and seeing where I'll be stopping by, you can check out my author website, consistently, aimee.com/events. And my name's spelled AIMEE. And then our webpage at Rehumanize International, it's rehumanizeintl.org/book-tour-2022. Both of those pages have the events up for where I'll be headed in the coming months. But for the time being, I know that this effort to share the consistent life ethic on a local level across the country, I think it has the power to change the world if we'll let ourselves be moved by it.
Well, Aimee Murphy, thank you so much for sharing your story and for sharing the invitation and the challenge to embrace a consistent life ethic.
My pleasure, Ken. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to Aimee Murphy. Find links to her book tour and to the organization Rehumanize International in the show notes. Subscribe to Ethics and Culture Cast so that you can always get the latest episodes by visiting ethicscenter.nd.edu/podcast. We would love your feedback. Please review the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts, and email your suggestions to cecpodcast@nd.edu. Our theme music is I Don't Know by Grapes, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution License. We'll see you next time on Ethics and Culture Cast. Until then, make good decisions.